Okay, for a look at what's making news in print this morning, we're joined by Dr. Scott Burchill, International Relations Expert and Honorary Fellow at Deakin University. Hey, Scott, good morning to you.
Good morning, Michael.
Now, very heavy focus on the federal political, the election campaign this morning. Let's kick off with the Australian. It has its take on the latest news poll.
Well, it's like an avoidance, really. The Murdoch press has been basically a PR outfit for the government, and the problem they had this morning is that the two-party preferred vote in Newspoll has remained steady despite what we're told was a horrendous week for the opposition leader, Mr Albanese. So instead of dealing with that issue, which must be frustrating for them because they're clearly barracking for the Prime Minister, they're basically saying that it's unsure whether it'll be possible for either party to govern in their own right. Now, at 53-47, I think that's probably a very decisive result if that's the two-party vote when we get to the election on the 21st. So I'm not quite sure why. I guess they're just trying to frame it in the most positive way they can, but I'm sure that the people in Newspoll and people at Murdoch Press would be very upset about the fact that they had the ALP had, by their standards, a fairly poor first week of the campaign, but that hasn't been reflected in opinion polls.
I guess the broader issue, one of the broader issues is we've had a couple of polls, the Resolve poll and the Nine papers yesterday, with a similar result, and that is, Scott, both major parties hovering around the mid-35 or the mid-30s percentage range in primary vote. And as we know, you really need a figure with a 4 in front of it to win majority government. The bigger question is, what does this say about declining support for the major parties as a whole, with potentially increasing support for independents and minor parties?
Well, we're starting to see growing concern both in the Murdoch press and in Nine newspapers about the power and the strength of independents. It's difficult to make a broad judgment about them all across the board because they're going to have varying results from time to time in different electorates. But clearly, the government must be very concerned that if this is the best position they can get into within the campaign, having Mr Albanese on the back foot, extremely negative press about a so-called gaffe in the first week, as if somehow or other that was a significant issue for policy. And this is the best they can do out of that. I think they would be very concerned. Now, no one gets a majority in the Senate and the House of Representatives these days, and no one expects that. But if these figures hold up through the rest of the campaign, I think these translate to a fairly comfortable win for the opposition, for the ALP, and that must be very concerning. Although I see Simon Benson saying this morning on the front page of The Australian that Mr Albanese has made himself unelectable. I'm just not quite sure how he comes to that conclusion, given the figures that are exactly and immediately above his byline.
Let's turn to another News Corp paper now, the Daily Telegraph. Its focus this morning is energy prices.
Well, it's both the front page of the Daily Telegraph and the front page of the Herald Sun. Again, Murdoch pushing a very scare campaign, basically, that somehow or other by updating the electricity poles and modernising the electricity grid, that this is going to be a $560 additional cost to electricity bills across the country. So this is a kind of traditional standard scare campaign. I think we can disregard it, but it's probably indicative of the fact that they can't carry the issue of declining support for the ALP overall. So we've got a scare campaign in the front page of both those tabloids this morning, arguing that if you vote for Labor, you're going to be out of pocket on electricity. I'm not quite sure what their argument is here, is that somehow or other we should allow the electricity poles to just deteriorate and leave, and basically collapse over the period of time. Labor is committed to modernising some of the infrastructure, which is badly in need of modernisation. But I guess they're grasping at straws at this point.
Okay, just before we move on to the final story, I mean, you clearly are arguing News Corp has picked a side here. It's backing Scott Morrison. How does it compare, in your view, and you have a very long memory, to the 2013 campaign when all the News Corp papers unashamedly barracked for Tony Abbott, and we all recall that memorable headline in the Daily Telegraph, "Kick this mob out." How does it compare to 2013 in your view at this stage?
Well, I think it's very interesting that everyone is assuming that there's an election here will be decisively changed during the campaign, a result, whereas I think there's a very small undecided vote. And the size of the undecided vote really will determine whether or not any of these campaigns in the media to change the government or to keep the government in place, in the case of Murdoch, will actually work. I think there is still, I think a lot of these papers preach to the converted. A lot of the people who read these newspapers are already, particularly Murdoch papers, are already coalition voters, so they're not going to win over a large number of people. But it's all about agenda setting, you know, setting the issue of the day, who won the week. And this is unfortunately a fairly trivial aspect of politics these days, as if somehow or other we're focusing on the horse race, who's going to win the actual result, rather than any serious evaluation of any of the policies. We've heard nothing about higher education, domestic violence. We've heard nothing about so many key issues that the community is really interested in hearing about. And I know it's early days, but it would be nice if we could just move from refracting everything through who's going to win and start looking at some policies in detail. And we've yet to see that. And unfortunately, the ABC is also guilty of that. But let's hope things change over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, well, we want to get some policy debates happening here on News Breakfast over the course of the campaign. But of course, debates take two to tango, so we'll keep our viewers updated on that front. Let's finally finish with The Age. Speaking of independent challenges, that paper has a list of their various demands should there be a hung parliament.
Yeah, look, the independents have been very clear from a long way out that their focus is on both real action on climate change and real action on an independent commission against corruption. They're the two overwhelmingly important issues. This is not new, although it's presented in The Age this morning as if it's suddenly they've discovered what the independents are actually concerned about. They've been campaigning on this now for months. Now they've got a real boost by the fact that the government seems to have dropped the ball on an independent commission against corruption. And of course, they see the government as being vulnerable on climate change. So it remains to be seen whether these independents now become front and centre in the media campaign to, particularly in the Murdoch press, but also perhaps in what's sometimes called, the 9 newspapers are sometimes called, mini Murdoch these days, whether or not they actually become a target, a front and centre target for those media outlets, because it's clear that in cases such as Goldstein, Warringah, and other of these key marginal seats, that sitting Liberal members are under enormous electoral pressure from independents who are targeting them directly, mainly because of their lack of action on climate change. And we'll see an increasing focus on them and their campaigns as we get into the election campaign in the next few weeks.
Scott Burchill, thank you. That was quite the chat.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Scott. OK, let's bring in Lisa in Cairns, focusing on the local papers there. What do they got, Lisa?
Look, I just wanted to give you an idea, Michael. First of all, just with the Courier Mail and the placement of the politics, talking about what Scott was mentioning in regards to the discussion over coal and Anthony Albanese here, but it's the Cairns Post that is the happier, positive news. Have a look at that photo at the top there, people out and about. I can tell you, Cairns is absolutely booming. It's probably busting this weekend, the hospitality venues. This is the first time, Michael, that they've had a holiday period, the Easter period, where they haven't had border restrictions, they haven't had snap lockdowns, and people have voted with their feet and they've turned up here in Cairns. I can tell you, we couldn't get a meal anywhere last night. It was packed out. Jammed packed. So that is a good news story. The far north rejoices as the new normal arrives. Doesn't mean that there aren't all those pressures that we've spoken about and will continue to talk about with housing, hospital, aged care, job security, and in fact, getting the staff to work in all these hospitality venues. That continues to be a problem for them. But interesting, Cairns Post, joyful photo on the front and good news story for a city that has really copped it hard.
Yeah, good news story indeed. Lisa, thank you. See you shortly. Let's get you